Well, hello out there in YouTube land. This is Jay Kloddick again, and tonight's episode I'm going to give you an update of where I am at with my USS Constellation from the episode The Doomsday Machine. For this build, as you recall, I am utilizing the original 66 vintage long box Starship Enterprise tooling, the 18-inch kit, because that's what they used in the episode in the second season episode of Star Trek when they actually made the ship. They took an original AMT kit and then they heavily trashed it. My plan is to build a replica of that ship, trying as much as possible to replicate details found on that studio model, but not necessarily duplicating exactly. So in some areas I'm going a little more advanced, as it were, into what you see, just because it's a model that has to stand up under scrutiny at model contests and also on display, whereas the one that was built for the episode, that only had to appear in a few key shots. Well, for starters, let's talk about the secondary hull. Let's get the warp engines out of the way. For this model, rather than putting it on a stock stand, I wanted something a little different. So the display base is just a undecorated trophy plaque, which I bought a few years ago from a trophy shop. Piece of brass rod. Secondary hull of the model right here. You can kind of see it illuminated in the plastic from the background lights. In order to get this piece mounted to the display base, I drilled a hole in the bottom of the secondary hull after I filled all the seams, and I slammed a bunch of two-part epoxy putty in there, Milliput brand specifically. Aves epoxy sculpt works as well, but I couldn't find my containers of that, so I resorted to utilizing the Milliput. Plus, also, since the Milliput's being used on the inside, you don't have to worry about any crusties or contamination in the putty as much. But what I did was, in order to get this piece of brass tubing to fit, I just rolled the Milliput into a bunch of snakes and slammed them in there, and then after it's set up, I slammed the brass tube in there and let it dry in this position. I've actually kind of got two positions I could display this in, either one sitting at level position or the second one sitting at kind of a nose down position to make it look like the Starship is drifting when the model is complete. As for the display base itself, I think I might actually use a picture of the Doomsday Machine, that frontal shot, and I might actually build up part of its open maw. Kind of an idea for a non-dioramic display base, just so that if anybody's wondering, okay, why have we got a trash Starship model here, and then they'll see the Doomsday Machine, they'll go, oh, now I know what episode that's from. But that's where I'm at with that assembly. Secondary hull itself, of course, doesn't really have any visible damage on it. Most of that was done to the warp engines and the primary hull. There is some weathering that's going to be done to it, but that's going to be relatively minor to what I'm going to do to the other assemblies. Let's get these out of the way. Okay, most prominent feature, of course, is the saucer section. Now, this is the area that anybody that's seen the episode, most people are familiar with, and indeed, looking at the screen capture, you can see the blast areas pretty well, 1, 2, 3. In terms of the details I wanted to add, I didn't want to necessarily add details like you might find in a Franz Joseph Star Trek blueprint set, mainly because the Franz Joseph set blueprints were not put out until after Star Trek had been off the air for a few years. Plus, also these areas in the front right here, the details are pretty easy to see in the screen capture. So I tried to replicate as much as possible what those details were. This area right here, these two tank-like protrusions, they're pieces of stretched sprue that have been bent over to look like, I don't know, water tankage that's been bent when the hull breached. I've also got some other little pieces of styrene and such. One thing I did was the inside the hull, I've got pieces of aluminum foil back there to kind of back up the walls, give it kind of a jagged shape, like structures that have been buckled or walls that have collapsed. Aluminum foil does a pretty good job for that, although admittedly, with it not being very stiff, sometimes you can get to the right shape and then it will flex out of position before you get it glued in properly. The area on the other side, a little bit more of that. It's kind of a little more open. Looking at the picture here, looks like they got another little piece of sprue stuck in there. I decided not to go with that. Instead, I decided to build it up to make it look like part of a wall, a divider separating two rooms in the outer hull. It kind of looks like there's a little protrusion there, but it's a little different. Now, if you notice, I don't have any deck divider separating like deck 5 from deck 6, mainly because I saw no evidence of that in the on the original on the screen captures I got of the original studio model, and for all I know, these outer decks could have been larger storage sections. Plus, also, since these two areas on the hull, the two areas on the front of the hull are easy to spot, I went with something that kind of looked more reminiscent of what you saw in the studio model. However, on the back, this area right here, which you never really saw except for distance shots, that one I actually went in and built in a second deck arrangement. There we go. Couple of corridors there lining the outside of the saucer. Now, in terms of practicality of a starship, thinking that these areas might be water tanks or something like that actually makes a lot of sense, because water is a good insulator in case of radiation, such as from solar flare activity or something like that. Just stand behind a water tank and you're nice and insulated from it, because the water absorbs all the radiation. But I'm pretty happy with how the saucer turned out. If you notice, yes, I did grind off the grid. It's off of there. There's a couple areas where there's kind of hints of it, but saucer is as smooth as a baby's bottom. Bridge unmodified, because the AMT bridge is accurate to the constellation. Let's move on to the warp engines. First, we got the portside warp engine, where if you look close in the printout, it's the front end of that warp engine is totally trashed. The back end is close to normal. Of course, the engine's also bent over at an angle, but I can do that when I put it on the secondary hull. Again, for the inside of the warp engine, I Use pieces of stretch sprue and also some smaller rectangular, triangular, and half circular pieces to make it look like that there were pieces of wiring and conduit pipe that got blown up when this section of the warp engine exploded. Again, am I matching anything from any blueprints? No, I'm not, because I'm trying to replicate something very similar to what the studio model had rather than trying to duplicate what some plan set developed after the episode came up with as to what is in there. One thing I will point out, if you do build a long box kit, these two pieces on top of the warp engines here, the holes for this outer section are kind of sitting over at a shallower angle than the ones on this side. It's like they're not truly offset by 90 degrees. I glued them on that way originally, and I didn't like the looks, so I pulled them out, filled the holes, and re-glued them. So they're not strictly at the proper angle for what the studio model had. And see how splayed out they look. But I'm happy with the way they look. I gotta live with this model. And let's look at the other warp engine. This one got the most extreme damage of all the sub-assemblies. Front end blown to heck. You got that dangling piece of conduit wiring in the front there. Back section, same thing. We'll have aluminum foil, a little bit more of a conduit pipe, and again some of the frayed wiring appearance. Once I paint that up with silver, black, and gray, that should look pretty good. Protrusions on top of the engines, blown to heck, all jagged in appearance. Similar to what the side shots show here. But anyway, that's where I'm at right now. Now that I've shot this video, I can actually glue these sub-assemblies together and get all the angles looking the way I want it. And so next time you see a video, it won't be too far in the future. But now that I'm to this state, I can glue the major sub-assemblies together and it'll start to look like a starship. Thank you for watching.